Bene, buon pomeriggio a tutti e bentrovati in questa nuova sede di Trieste Next, che in realtà non è nuova. Il Teatro Verdi di Trieste è proprio qui dove 10 anni fa è iniziata questa avventura di Trieste Next, il Festival della ricerca scientifica. Quindi è stato molto complesso, però abbiamo fortemente voluto un ritorno, tra virgolette, a casa. Quindi questo pomeriggio e questa sera saremo qui al Teatro Verdi, che ovviamente ringraziamo. Partiamo il pomeriggio con la presentazione di questo libro, che trovate anche all'esterno, Fuori I Dati, di Thomas Ramge e Viktor Mayer-Schönberger, edito da Egea, content partner storico ormai di Trieste Next. Lasciamo subito la parola al nostro autore, al nostro speaker di oggi pomeriggio, Viktor Mayer-Schönberger, e chiamerei anche sul palco Massimo Cerofolini, conduttore di Eta Beta su Radio Rai 1, autore radiofonico e autore televisivo, e con noi sul palco ci sarà anche Andrea Di Costanzo, interprete. L'evento si svolgerà in lingua inglese e le vostre domande, se avete piacere di farle in italiano, abbiamo appunto un interprete che ci assiste. Io chiamo ora sul palco il professor Mayer-Schönberger, che uscirà da questi tendaggi. Professor Schönberger, please join me on stage. Please. Grazie per l'applauso. Prego, please sit. Massimo Cerofolini. Prego, no, on the right hand side. E Andrea Di Costanzo. Buon ascolto.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Comincerei con un esempio, con una storia. La storia di una donna a Chicago che deve prendere un taxi. Apre il telefonino, apre l'applicazione di Uber, la piattaforma, e chiama il taxi. Ma c'è un ritardo. Perché c'è questo ritardo? C'è questo ritardo perché l'autista che ha preso la chiamata, il giorno prima, per fare un piacere alla moglie, si era completamente rasato la barba. Il server a San Francisco di Uber segnala un'anomalia e questa anomalia viene data in gestione a una donna di 30 anni che vive a Bombay, che sta allattando suo figlio e che in cucina apre lo schermo del computer e una clessidra gli segnala che ha 10 secondi per decidere se la foto del guidatore che è in possesso nel server ufficiale di Uber corrisponde a quella che l'autista ha appena mandato per autenticare la corsa. 10 secondi, 9, 8, alla fine lei ci pensa un po', clicca sì e ha guadagnato 1 centesimo. Lei pure fa parte di una piattaforma, la piattaforma di Amazon che si chiama Turk Mechanical. È una piattaforma che è un po', diciamo, il posto centrale in cui tutti questi lavoratori del click si ritrovano. Ce ne sono anche altre. Ma perché questo? Perché malgrado il nome che noi diamo all'intelligenza artificiale, gli algoritmi sono tutt'altro che intelligenti e hanno bisogno di un continuo lavoro di noi umani per verificare, per esempio, in questo caso se una foto corrisponde, in un altro caso può essere se un cartello stradale su cui poi dovranno essere addestrate le macchine che si guidano da sole è effettivamente quello che noi sappiamo sia. Se per esempio in una partita di calcio il gol è stato fatto di testa a quale minuto, se per esempio c'è una chat in cui c'è qualcosa che non va, una moderazione, un linguaggio scurrile, c'è da decidere se bloccare quel post o meno, il caso dubbio che non riescono a coprire le intelligenze artificiali. Se per esempio chi usa Alexa sa che è divertente fargli le domande più strane, ma lui bene o male cerca di risponderti sempre, ecco, ti risponde perché c'è qualcuno umano che sta lì per 1 centesimo che si inventa una risposta. Tutto questo qualcuno l'ha definito, come Antonio Casilli, che doveva essere qui ieri sera a parlare proprio della tematica, i nuovi schiavi del click. Perché sapete che la figura della donna di Bombay non è una figura rara, ma ci sono milioni e milioni di persone che in tutto il mondo, spesso dislocate in aree marginali dell'Africa o dell'Asia, svolgono questo lavoro continuo di revisione degli algoritmi per 1 centesimo, per 2 centesimi. Ed è una problematica enorme di cui avremmo dovuto parlare ieri sera. Però questo ci basta per introdurre l'argomento di oggi, perché il termine schiavi rimanda alla parola che ci sembrava del secolo scorso sia il colonialismo. Colonialismo che nel secolo scorso sfruttava la fisicità delle persone per estrarre fondamentalmente materiale e oggi invece ha una nuova versione. Non ci sono più le vecchie potenze come il Regno Unito, come la Francia, la Germania, il Giappone, la nostra piccola Italietta, ma ci sono due grandi potenze che si contendono questo nuovo fenomeno. La Cina da una parte e gli Stati Uniti dall'altra. Solo che al posto della materia prima tradizionale, in questo caso ciò che viene estratto sono i dati. Questo fenomeno ha portato dopo una ubriacatura di entusiasmo che tutti abbiamo avuto nei confronti di internet, dei social network, per i tanti benefici che ci ha offerto, a una disillusione, perché abbiamo bene o male capito tutti che il gioco poi è finito nelle mani di quei 4, 5, 10 grandi colossi del digitale che hanno accumulato talmente tanti dati da essere ormai le aziende più ricche del pianeta e soprattutto di condizionare in modo determinante le nostre vite. In meglio? Per certi aspetti sì, sicuramente, però anche in peggio. Perché? Perché, come in questo caso che vi ho citato, è sempre più diffusa la modalità di lavoro basata sullo sfruttamento e sulle basse retribuzioni, sul precariato, perché la qualità di internet, sappiamo tutti, che con il modello della polarizzazione, che è quello che rende più accessibile e più aumentabile il serbatoio di dati, la qualità di ciò che troviamo su internet è sempre più scadente, sempre più legata a false notizie, sempre più legata a fenomeni d'odio, ma soprattutto perché questo fenomeno sta in qualche modo distruggendo la capacità di innovare in cui noi credevamo veramente di essere immersi in questa società, perché l'accumulo di dati in poche imprese ha creato dei monopoli. Allora, l'esempio da cui sono partito, subito l'omaggio, e anche le considerazioni che andiamo a fare, e che ho in parte fatto, sono frutto di questo bel libro che si chiama Fuori I Dati, ed è stato scritto da Thomas Ramg, poi mi correggerà il suo socio, e il qui presente Viktor Mayer-Schönberger. Sono due autori che hanno messo a fuoco una visione alternativa per cui ci invitano a domandarci: ma davvero dobbiamo rassegnarci a un futuro così, in cui contiamo sempre meno, in cui il potere, la ricchezza, le regole del gioco sono demandate a un nucleo ristretto di monopoli? Ecco, forse a partire proprio dall'Europa, che in questa gara conta poco meno di niente, possiamo recuperare il controllo dei dati e possiamo ricreare una forma di profitto più a misura di noi uomini. Allora, benvenuto a Viktor Mayer-Schönberger. Buongiorno, welcome here. So, allora, we'll move to English with the help of, what's your name, sorry? Andrea. The first question is just the consequence of I have just told. This illusion that we have find in the recent years about the possibility, the agreement between us and the big tech that is not so win-win as we believed before. It's something that is not fair. What is the vision of your book?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me and for being able to talk about our vision and to talk about what we write in the book. Let me precede that by saying I am not a technophobe. I love computers. I love data, but in a certain way, in a particular way. And we don't see that particular way being articulated and brought to the forward in either Silicon Valley and the United States on the one hand, or in China on the other hand. So the vision of the book is not to shy away from data. The vision of the book is not to be ignorant and to close our eyes and to not get vaccinated. We didn't write that in the book, but I needed to say that as well. The future is not about ignorance, because humanity is facing so many extremely severe challenges. Not just a pandemic, not just the climate change and the severe degradation of our environment, but also social injustice and inequalities of an order that hasn't existed in many decades. And add to that our need to rejig our economy. Many, many, many jobs that exist will go away. Now, in the end, in 50 years, we might look back and say, well, we have now more jobs than we had before, much like in the Industrial Revolution. But it's different jobs. And you can't take a truck driver who has lost the job to an autonomous driving car and make him a C# programmer overnight, or a masseur for that matter. So we are looking at challenges everywhere. And these challenges we cannot solve by closing our eyes. It just doesn't work. But that is, in a way, what Europe has been trying to do when it comes to understanding the world through data. Then our religion so far has been to emphasize ignorance rather than knowledge. And that is deeply, deeply anti-European. It is not what the DNA of Europe is all about. Europe, over the last 200 years, has been where it has developed and evolved all about knowing more rather than less.
There is an expression very precise that used in the book that I like very much is the situation that we live today is a frenzy stasis, una stasi frenetica. That is just what we feel. We feel like to be immersed in innovation circus Luna Park, but instead the situation, the truth is that it's very stasis, everything.
Absolutely. You know, I was just chatting with us beforehand and I said, I have a very old computer up here. It hasn't been updated for a long time. And that's very different from our iPhones. We are updating them all the time, it seems. And we are constantly in this frenetic dynamic of having to update and catch up and be there and learn of the latest things that happen. And yet, my friends, all the measures that we have on innovation and on innovative dynamics tell us that our time is a non-innovative time. We may feel like that little rat in the wheel that is going faster and faster and faster and not moving forward at all. That's the kind of innovation, quote unquote, that we have today. We update constantly our apps, but they don't get much better as a process.
You say in the book that we have the last big things like iPhone, like Zoom, like Alexa, but they cannot be compared with the innovation of the last century. Airplane, cars, nuclear power, the web, and so on.
Antibiotics.
Antibiotic.
Indeed, antibiotics.
But we don't are aware of this.
Yes, when my grandmother was born, they didn't have a water toilet, right? They didn't yet, the doctors didn't yet practice hand washing. And life expectancy was much lower. So over the 20th century, we improved, despite those terrible setbacks of the First and the Second World War, we improved dramatically. And the 1990s, thanks to the internet, we improved dramatically. But what innovation has Amazon produced on e-commerce over the last 20 years that wasn't done in 1999? In 1999, they already had product recommendations. I could already purchase a book and purchase a video. So what's really new?
In the book, you deny several cliches, several conventions we have. For instance, we will look one by one. The first one that touched me very much is the sentence that we always repeat when we speak about data, is the data are the new oil. You say that is not true. Why?
You know, even the Economist, the famous magazine of the elites, titled "Data is the New Oil." But that looks at data and says, then data is just another resource, like oil, like coal, like gold. And what we need to do is to then capture it, collect it, and then put it in the basement and wait for the price to go up. But that's wrong. The data and the value of data is only being reaped by using it, by putting it to a particular purpose. You know, I don't need to use gold in order to keep the value or increase it. Data is different. Data is not a resource. Data is something else. It's like a glue that makes social transactions and coordinations easier. Yuval Harari, the big best-selling author, he said, the one thing that we must remember that made humanity big was our ability to coordinate. And how do we coordinate? Well, thanks to communication and information. And so information is the glue that glues all of us together. It's not oil. Oil doesn't glue us together. Oil stinks. Information and data is different.
And why? Who has the fault of this slowdown of the innovation? Up to you.
Well, so if you think that data is the new oil, what you do is you put it in the basement and you wait. That's what the European companies have been doing. In Europe, 85% of all the data that is being collected is not even used once. Not even used once. Can you imagine how wasteful that is? You spend a lot of time and energy collecting the data and then you don't do anything with it? On the other hand, there are a small number of very large companies, mostly in the US, the so-called platform companies or digital superstars. I don't like the word platform very much. Digital superstars like Google and Amazon and Apple and Facebook, who not only collect a lot of data, but use the data over and over and over again that they collect. And every time they use the data that they have collected, they generate value, commercial value. And so what we see is a very large group in the economy that just collects data and doesn't do anything with it, and a very small group of companies that collect a lot of data, use it, make a lot of money, and create a lot of power for themselves.
The question is, why the big company of the last centuries in healthcare field, in studios of movie, in car, in electricity, didn't catch this wave, and they had all the resources, the people, they have money, they had everything. But in the book you write, while BMW was just improving a little bit the engine, Google was mapping all the street in the world. That's the reason.
Yes. So why those GAFAs, those Googles and Amazons and Facebooks, why they became so powerful has to do with their understanding of the value of data. Now, unfortunately, nobody else did understand, or few others did understand it. Then they became powerful, and then they became lazy. And now we are just dominated by lazy, boring, large companies that pretend to give us better and better versions every time. But for a certain period of time, these very large companies were innovative because they used data. And let me tell you that story, if we have a little bit of time. Let me tell you the story about self-driving cars. Okay. So, who about you, who believes that in 5 years we will have self-driving cars on the streets? Okay. All of you are Europeans, it seems. Now, let me tell you that there is a way by which we measure how good a self-driving car works. And that is how many kilometers it can drive on average before a human needs to jump in and intervene. Brake or steer or not do anything because the car is just doing fine. And that's an important measure. Now, 2015, the typical self-driving car of an American car company was going 400 kilometers on average before requiring a human to intervene. 400 kilometers, not bad. At the same year, Google's self-driving car was going 2,000 kilometers, 5 times better. So you ask why, and the answer is the car manufacturer put a couple of sensors in, 2 or 3 or 4, and they collected data. And then they squeezed the data and squeezed all of the insight out of the little data that they had. And then they went 400 kilometers. Great. What did Google do? Google said, money, not important for us. We print money. So they added all of the sensors to their car twice over that they could think of. And a typical Google self-driving car collects 1 billion data points a second. Whoa. And analyzes that. And therefore, by using that data, that training data, they can go further. Now, what did they do between 2015 and 2020? I give you the numbers for December of 2020, is the last numbers that we have. The self-driving car of Daimler-Benz, Mercedes, on average drives 41 kilometers before requiring a human intervention. Why? Because German engineering is all focused on the sensors and isn't focused on the data. They don't get it. What does the Google car do? 47,985 kilometers. Over 1,000 times better. And the reason is data, because they use the data to train their artificial intelligence. It's called machine learning, and it makes all the difference. In order to take an idea and to realize it in our time, what you need is enough training data in addition to the ideas that you have. And that is a shift in innovation that we see today. Sorry to tell you that example in all gory details, but I tell you, 47,000 kilometers without human intervention, that means driving better than me.
Another debunk of your book is about privacy. Every one of us believes, before reading your book, that privacy, the European regulation of GDPR, was something good because it was something that would have protected our data from misuse of big companies. But according to you, this is a big waste of money that slow down the European companies and give advantages to the big tech companies. Why?
Well, we Europeans tend to be so proud of ourselves because we have such strong data protection. So with such strong data protection, you know, you need to give consent. You need to give OK, click OK, after you have read the notice, the privacy notice, the terms of service, and you thought about it, and then you decided whether to click OK or not. How many of you have read one privacy notice in detail? I feel so good. Me neither. Only to read the privacy notice of the top 10 online platforms takes over 200 hours of reading time. I don't have that time. So I click OK, you click OK, we do that. Now, does that give us a sense of data protection? Does this give us a sense of privacy? Does this empower us? No. It just means an extra step that I have to do. That's wrong. This is data protection formalism. What we need is data protection that bites. And that means responsibility for those that gain all of the economic insight. And we do that in other areas all the time. You know, when you go to the grocery store and you purchase something, you don't bring your chemistry lab and test what you're getting there. But on Facebook, you supposedly have to go through the terms and then weigh whether you want the data to be used that way or not. You're not an expert, I'm not an expert. And in the grocery store, because I'm not an expert in grocery chemistry, the grocery store owner and the supplier are responsible. And we have food safety agencies to take care of that, and we have regulation. In data protection, all of the pressure is on the shoulder of the individual. That's not where it belongs. And that is why data protection in Europe is actually data protection theater rather than data protection reality.
You called all this the religious of privacy that we Europeans trust in.
I have been an altar boy for 11 years, so I know a lot about religion.
So in the book, you crushed a lot of my opinion, because another opinion that I trusted was about Gaia X. Gaia X is the project of Europe that want to create a kind of big server where all the European data of all the European companies or people are protected, and just to defend them from the server of China or USA that can control our life, that can steal our data in terms of patents and business, etc. Also, this for you is not okay. Why?
Well, first of all, to set up a cloud service is a commodity business. You don't make much money off it. And then you can always encrypt the data and store it in an encrypted way, and the owner of the cloud service cannot look into the data at all. So actually taking over cloud services and taking it away from Amazon or Google or Microsoft isn't a particularly smart economic idea, nor is it a particularly good idea when we come to digital sovereignty. Because it doesn't give you much sovereignty. What we need is something else. What we need is to break out of the data silos that we have in Europe, to work together, to pool our data, to reuse it. And so for that, we need all kinds of standards and so forth. To the extent that Gaia X produces those standards, Gaia X is great. So far, not so many standards have come out of Gaia X. But you know what? A lot of very large companies are involved in Gaia X. And for them, it's a great idea to get a lot of subsidies from Brussels for technical infrastructure that is behind its times but needs money to nevertheless survive. That's not the Europe I want. I want the Europe to be vital and agile and lively, rather than boring and old and stodgy and being lifted up by government subsidies left, right, and center.
Let's get to your proposal in the book, opening the data to relaunch European economy. How would be possible technically? What are the conditions that can be true?
Yes, it is absolutely possible. Look, if innovation changes its shape, its inner nature, from just an idea that you then move into a product to an idea that needs data to train the systems, then those companies that have just good ideas, like the startups, the entrepreneurs, the small and medium enterprises, will not be able to take their ideas and produce an innovation because they miss the data. So what you need to do is to basically enable them to access data from large companies that have lots of data. And that's the key idea. The key idea is a progressive data sharing mandate, that is to force the large companies that have lots of data to let the smaller companies, but also civil society, to access some of the data. We're not taking anybody's data away, we're not expropriating, this isn't communism. This is markets. This is creating an incentive for new companies, new entrepreneurs, small and medium enterprises to take their ideas and to realize them. And it has already worked. You know where? In the United States. I give you two examples. One is from the book, and the other isn't. It's new for you too. The first one is, 10 years ago, Google bought a large company in travel, doing travel data processing for airlines and so forth. And they bought the company basically for the data. And the American government stepped in and said, yes, you can do that, but only if you permit other companies, including your biggest competitors, to access the data that you just bought for 5 years. And Google said yes, they set up the system, everything worked beautifully for 5 years. When the 5 years were over, the very second they were over, Google stopped it. Any large company like that would stop it, right? If they don't have to do it, why let other competitors, creep up on them? The other example, but it works if it is mandated and it works beautifully. The other example that isn't in the book is about AT&T. You know AT&T, the telephone company in the United States? That was broken up, divided up in the 1980s and is now being used all around the world to show that we can break up those large companies. But what nobody tells us is that once we broke them up in the 1980s, they came back and AT&T is bigger today than ever before. If you don't go to the root cause of the problem, you don't get the problem solved. In the 1950s, however, AT&T was already under government threat and sued by the US government for competition violations. And then AT&T was forced to do something, to take all the knowledge, all the patents that they had, including the patent on the transistor that was developed in the Bell Labs, and to give those patents away for free to everybody. And you know what that generated practically overnight? The digital revolution, Silicon Valley. It all happened because the startup companies could now take the transistor patent for free, didn't have to license it, and started Silicon Valley. That is the kind of dividend, the innovation dividend that we get from data sharing.
There is an example that you write in the book about the famous campus of Facebook that everyone likes because it's of fashion, ping pong, pub, bar, meeting people. And also this is for you something bad, because yes. 20 years ago there was,
yes.
That's why.
Of course, you know the Facebook and Google, I've been there. It's beautiful. There is like sushi restaurants,
for free.
For free. There is like yoga club. There is unbelievable. But there is a wonderfully perverse strategy behind it. And the strategy is to keep you on the campus so that you never leave the campus except to go home and then fall asleep immediately, and then the next morning come back. Because the Googleplex or the Facebook campus does everything for you. That is not what made Silicon Valley great. There is a wonderful urbanist scientist, Anno Saxenian, who studied Boston's high-tech area and the Silicon Valley. And the Boston high-tech area, called Route 128, had more startup companies in the 1960s than Silicon Valley. And they became quite famous for a couple of years. But in Boston, the companies were vertically integrated. There were silos. The people stayed there in the company. They never went out to a bar to meet somebody from another company. There were no bars in the Route 128. I know it, I've been there. It's a boring highway. And there's all kinds of houses and office buildings. It's boring. You never meet anybody there. In the Silicon Valley in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, into the 1990s, you would go after work to that bar, and then you had a lot of martinis with somebody from the competitor, and you were sharing ideas. In fact, it was encouraged, job hopping was encouraged because it would replenish innovation in a company. And the non-disclosure agreements were invalidated by the courts in California, and even companies set up agreements with their competitors to share some of the ideas. It was called co-opetition, cooperation and competition together. Co-opetition, and it worked beautifully, for example, in the hard disk industry in the 1990s. Silicon Valley became famous because of free flow of information. As Facebook and Google and Apple and Amazon stopped that, they basically cut their own lifeblood off, they cut their leg off, or more their brain. And so all that they can do is do what they have been doing all along and not innovate anymore. That's where we are today.
The connection between Xerox and Apple and Microsoft, so the system grow up.
Exactly, you know.
In the bar, in the pub.
Unbelievable. You know, there was this government agency called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency of the US Department of Defense. The guys there said, you know what? We will win the Cold War not with more nukes, that is with more nuclear weapons, but with smarter ideas. So we are creating this kind of project for smarter ideas. Now, the guy who ran it said, you know, I am sick and tired of working for the government. And so he was hired by the Xerox company, the copying company, to set up a think tank on the future of information processing. And it was called Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center of Xerox. And in Xerox PARC, they hired all the coming stars. And you know what the Xerox PARC did in about 5 or 6 years? They developed the personal computer, the mouse, the laser printer, PostScript, graphical user interfaces, object-oriented programming, local area networks, Ethernet, and the foundation for what we call the internet today. In this small little shop of about 100 people or so. And then Steve Jobs got to look at what they had to show. And he was blown away. Apple at that time was still producing the Apple II. But he saw the future, graphical user interfaces, mouse, laser printer. So he went back to Apple and created a skunkworks, a team of people to work day and night on a new computer. It was called the Macintosh. And then he showed it off to his good friend, Bill Gates. And Bill Gates was thrown away, blown away by it. And he said, gosh, we need to do something like that because our PCs run this boring MS-DOS system. And so they created Windows. That's the kind of way by which ideas spread through free flow.
Tell us something more about the possibility that your proposal can give us. For instance, what is very interesting is the cross-uses, the reuse. I mean, something apparently something that useless for us can be value, can be very, very value for people that can create correspondences between other data or other subject items. That's the true value of data.
Indeed, because no company can understand what the data can be used for completely. Others may use the same data for very different purposes. So for example, you know that some of us have these Fitbits or these devices on our hand that record our activity, our physical activity during the day. Now, with some of those devices, the physical activity is uploaded to servers and then people can compete against each other and all this. they found out, the company that had this data, they found out that they can use the data and analyze earthquakes. Earthquakes? How is that possible? Well, in California, just think about it. You know, a lot of people have those Fitbits. They sleep with them. Suddenly there is an earthquake at night. Wah! They get up. That is recorded on their Fitbit. And so you see that, you know, when you look at the graph, they're sleeping, wah! They're getting up. And that is the kind of moment of the earthquake. Now, when you have hundreds of thousands of them, and you see who got up and who slept through it, you get a sense of how strongly an earthquake was felt at a particular location. And so you can develop earthquake models. Believe it or not, they didn't exist before, and they were being built like that. There is, I'll give you one more example, a thermometer company where people can measure their temperature. And it's mostly either for, you know, parents to measure temperature for their kids, or for women to measure their temperature in order to predict their cycle. And the temperature is also uploaded to a server, anonymized, but with a location, not an exact location, but a location in sort of which state it is. And you know what they could do with the data? They could see the pandemic coming because people became sick and had a fever, and it would like flash up. And so they saw the pandemic in real time. That is a reuse of a data that otherwise would just be sitting there.
So opening the data is not enough. You need to create an ecosystem like Apple does with the Apple Store. It pushes the innovators to create connection, networking, so that what European companies and systems should do.
And what governments should encourage, to build up an ecosystem where there is not just data, access to data available, but there is also a real innovation competition of how to use the data, where we give awards to those that use the data really well, where we have training sessions, where we have meetups and conferences, where people can share their experiences. It's all about the ecosystem. You know, you can change the world, but you cannot just change the world with one action. You need to sustain the change over time.
Two objections from people that can say no to this project. One you touched before is the expropriation, the risk of expropriation. The other is a disincentive use of data, because people say, a company says, why should I collect data if then I give to give someone else?
Yes, yes. Well, two easy answers. Of course, there is no ownership in data, and so we cannot theoretically even expropriate. But I'm not even practically or theoretically taking anything away by letting others have access to it. I don't want to take the data away from Amazon that they collect. They can use it. Google can use their self-driving car data perfectly fine. No problem. But I want other companies, other car companies, to be able to use that data. Because if we think about self-driving cars, it doesn't help us if Google has a very good self-driving car, but everybody else doesn't have a good self-driving car. We need good self-driving cars from multiple sources. And that is why we cannot have just one company control all of it. The disincentive or disincentivizing of collection of data, there's an easy answer to that, and I already provided it for you. 85% of the data that is being collected in Europe is not even used once. What does this mean? It means that we collect more data, but we don't use it. So in terms of incentives, we don't need more incentive to collect data, we need more incentive to use it. And that is what the progressive data sharing mandate does.
In the book, you speak about Schumpeter, the economist, the famous economist, and about his idea of the creative power of also entrepreneurship as an artist that can create, destroying, create, destroying. And despite this, Schumpeter said, I don't fear monopoly, but at some conditions. Is that true?
Well, Schumpeter, the guy who came up with creative destruction, he was a very interesting economist, innovation economist. Schumpeter was worried, greatly worried, that the future may actually be one where there is only a few very large companies that run the economy. And he feared that this would happen if small entrepreneurs, small companies would not have enough access to capital, because then they cannot grow fast enough and become true competitors to large companies, kick the incompetents out. And so he worried about the availability of capital. But interestingly enough, capital became available after the Second World War. In the United States, through things like venture capital. In Europe, through government programs like the European Recovery Program, ERP, that the Americans brought to Europe, and then in Italy, but also in Germany, was very important for the Wirtschaftswunder, for the economic miracle. So capital became available. The resource that Schumpeter thought was scarce, would be scarce and would be a problem, became available. Now, today, the resource that those digital startups need isn't money. Because with all the money in the world, they can't force Amazon to open their treasure trove of data. Amazon will just say, we don't need you to have access to our data. And so what those startups now need isn't more money. They need better access to data. And then that becomes a resource. This access becomes a resource that we need to make sure that those startups have.
Last question, then I ask you to ask question to our guest. European Commission, Europe. We are in the midst of a Cold War, the digital Cold War between China and the USA. What should be the position of our of Brussels and our nations?
You know, when you think you are in a situation where you have a binary choice, either black or white, think again. Usually there is another option. You just need to think very hard. And the option in Europe that has been around over the last couple of years was ignorance, was more data protection. Because we Europeans value our values. But all that it created is the GAFAs, and not an agile, vital digital economy in Europe. And that is so strange, because Europe has had so many good ideas. You know, MP3 and digital music, invented in Europe. You know, the World Wide Web, invented in Europe. In fact, MP3 was invented by the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, a partially publicly funded research network. And the World Wide Web came out of Sir Tim Berners-Lee work at CERN, a pan-European nuclear research conglomerate, mostly outside of Geneva in Switzerland. So we Europeans have been contributing the key elements to the digital revolution, but we haven't gained anything from it. Why? Because we left the others to commercialize it. And we said, but we are above it. But we can't be above everything forever. What we need to understand in Europe is that we became Europeans with our values because we understood the key element of enlightenment, that knowing more about the world is better than knowing less. Because knowing more about the world means making better decisions. And making better decisions means leading better lives. And that means we have an opportunity to meet the challenges of climate change, of economic and social degradation, but we need to be innovative. And for innovation, we need not just good ideas. We also need a way to take the idea and to realize it. And for that, we need the free flow of information and data. So our option in Europe is not less, but more understanding of the world. Not in the commercialist or in the mercantilist way of the United States or China, but in the enlightened way that made Europe what it is today.
Thank you, Viktor Mayer. Schönberger. So che it's not a company. Mi ho detto prima che normalmente lo presentano come Viktor Mayer della compagnia Schönberger. No, questo è un unico cognome. Allora, c'è qualcuno in sala che vuole fare qualche domanda, così approfondiamo un po' le cose che ci siamo detti? Un microfono lì. Non c'è un microfono? Prendiamo questo, che dice ti dispiace. Chi è che può portare un microfono in sala? C'è qualcuno che può aiutarci? No? Vabbè, vieni, avvicinati tu. C'è qualcuno dell'organizzazione che ci può dare una mano su questa cosa? Ecco, poi lo fai girare. Ok.
Yes. Can you? Is working? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. My question is about. I was wondering if we have the situation that, let's say, we free all the data, okay, and we start to have a new innovation, real innovation, not this stagnation that we have right now. How we can stop actually big companies to buy these innovations and to continue to have this monopoly? Is something that we can do? We should do it or not?
You know, it's a great question because, of course, a lot of the innovative companies in the Silicon Valley are always bought up by the large companies today. But there is an answer to that. Right now, there aren't that many innovative startups, and they have no pathway to scale up because they don't have access to data. So what the small startups do is to have an idea, to build a prototype, and then to shop around the prototype to the very large companies who have data. And the hope there is for the entrepreneur to be bought up, because that's the only way that the idea can take off. That's very different today. 70% of the startup companies in Silicon Valley today are being bought up by the large platforms. 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, 70% of the companies in Silicon Valley would IPO, would go on the stock market and scale up. Why? Because they could. Because at that time, access to data wasn't so concentrated as it is today. So as we open up the data flows, we give also those small startup companies a pathway to scale up. And that means that they don't have to sell out to Mr. Bezos or Mr. Zuckerberg.
Altre domande? Vedo mani alzate. Ecco, una mano lì. Passate il microfono, per favore, lì. Grazie.
Posso parlare in italiano? Poi
Sì, c'è l'interprete.
Invece la mia questione è su come però dare il giusto riconoscimento, quindi anche economico, ai dati. Perché con lo stesso ragionamento potrei pensare che sarebbe giusto dare a disposizione gratuitamente, ad esempio, tutti i libri di medicina. Perché con questi dati, con queste informazioni, qualcuno potrebbe magari scoprire una nuova cura. Però allora ci sarebbero solo libri gratuiti e questo ragionamento si potrebbe estendere a tutto. E quindi come dare il giusto riconoscimento all'autore di questi dati?
There is no author of the data. Data is data, unlike an intellectual creation like writing a book or writing a play or performing music or writing music. Unlike that, data is just a reflection of reality. It's just a mirror image of reality. There's a sensor that senses photons or that senses waves, and that generates data. So I don't see a need for authorship of data because we we recognize authorship only when it requires an intellectual capability. That's not the case here.
Altre domande? Microfono lì, poi lì. Chi si prenota dopo, così facciamo anche un po'. Per il momento queste due mani alzate. Nome?
Federica.
Federica.
From a regulation point of view, which are the main actions that organizations worldwide and governments should take to make this big data sharing idea possible?
The easiest and best is just to pass a law that says from now on you need to share the data. And that, for example, is what in Germany, the Social Democratic Party agreed in their party platform to bring about. They called it the Data for All law that they want to bring about. In other countries, they're thinking about similar ideas in the Netherlands and Switzerland, in the United Kingdom. Even Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she said last year when she presented the data strategy of the European Commission that it is imperative that we break the power of the large American platforms. She didn't say American, the large platforms. And even if that means that we need to force them to share their data with Europe and the European citizens. And so I think at a number of levels, national level, but also European level, we have a recognition that we need to move forward. And we'll see how quickly we get there. The Data Act that the European Commission is discussing needs more bite, needs to be harsher. On the other hand, some national regulations and some national pushes are going in the right direction. And in the field of open data, we are already seeing European-wide mandates. And it is important. It's totally crazy. Have you ever thought about it? It's totally crazy. In Europe, the application that is used most for mobility to get you from your door to your destination is Google Maps, an American platform. Why? Because all of those, or many of those public transport companies, the subway companies, the train companies in all of the nations have exclusive arrangements with Google to give them their real-time data. They give away the scheduled data for free, but the important real-time data, the actual data of the schedule, is not shared because they have exclusive arrangements with Google. That is crazy. We Europeans, through our tax money, are fueling online platforms like Google. That must stop, and immediately. And we need to pass and strengthen the open data laws that we have on the European Union level to force that. Not only that the public transport companies have to give away the data, but they have to give away the real-time data, not just the stupid scheduled data.
But how much the European politicians are aware of this?
Oh, I go around and I talk to a lot of the European politicians, and I do think that over the last 2 or 3 years, a lot changed. In fact, through the pandemic, a lot changed. Because through the pandemic, people began to understand the importance of sharing data. Remember that when the Chinese researchers isolated the virus for the first time, they worked and sequenced the RNA of the virus. They worked with Australian researchers in tandem over digital networks. And then they published the sequence online for everybody to use. And then people at the National Institute of Health in the United States, a publicly funded institution, took the data that they got for free and developed the first crucial element of the vaccine in 72 hours. The last vaccine that we produced took 10 years. This vaccine took less than a year. And you know who is the source of this innovation? The unleashing of power of sharing data and sharing information. It helped humanity survive. Why don't we power us in Europe with that tremendous force?
Actually, those words are not in the program of political parties in the election of Germany or Italy. Why? Okay, next question, please. Okay.
Oh, actually, can I answer the question? Sorry.
Okay.
You know why? Because of you. Because you failed me. You failed me. Your task. I look into the audience here and I see so many young faces. You need to rise up. You understand digital tools. You understand the use of digitization far better than the old, decrepit, white, male, middle-aged politicians that white, male, middle-aged guy deals with. You need to rise up. You need to push. Much like you are pushing for sustainability and the environment, you need to push for this too. If you don't, we fail. Your fault.
Grazie. Domanda.
Okay. Lei ha parlato dei dati, quindi della libertà, della condivisione dei dati, in un'ottica positiva. Ma come hanno mostrato anche in Social Dilemma, qual è l'altro lato della medaglia? Cioè questa condivisione dei dati così capillare non può essere un problema per le persone e quindi l'addiction che si sta creando a computer, ai social in generale?
Okay, very, very important question. Very important. You know, the use of data is a tool. And like every tool, it can be abused. There's no question about that. And we need to stop abuses of data. Most data that is being collected in Europe is non-personal data, generated by machines and engines and so forth. Sharing that data is unproblematic for the most part. But when we get to personal data, it becomes more difficult. And so in our book, we make the case that only data that is depersonalized should be shared, not personal data. Now, when you depersonalize data and you take away, you pseudonymize, not anonymize, but pseudonymize data, you take away most or practically all personal identifiers, and you make it very hard to re-identify the data. That means you take some value out, but there's still a lot of residual value left in the data that can and that should be shared. Therefore, sharing data is just one element of this future of Europe. The other element is to hold those that abuse data responsible. We cannot and must not put all the shoulders on the individuals. That's ridiculous. You know, everywhere else, when you buy a car and the car suddenly topples over, it's not your responsibility, it's the responsibility of the car manufacturer, who is also making the profits. And so we should also make the very large information platforms responsible for the abuse. And we also need to ensure that we are focused more strongly on the positive, innovative effect of non-personal data use rather than on learning the latest rumors in our social networks.
Grazie, thank you very much. Fuori i dati, rompere i monopoli sull'informazione per rilanciare il progresso, Thomas Rang e Viktor Mayer-Schönberger. Grazie a tutti. Grazie anche a Andrea. Grazie Andrea.